What's going on, my friends? I hope you're all doing absolutely fantastic. And today we're going to be talking about the A6700 against the A7 IV. Now, this is a very, very valid question because I think when it comes to value, it's definitely the best that Sony offers when it comes to hybrid. So photography and videography. Now they've just released the A6700. You know, it's really hard to say, but I actually do think this one has better value because of what it offers and obviously for the price point. But we're going to be talking about the differences because there are some things that this does and this doesn't do, but then there are some things that this does really well and this, just doesn't do well at all. And that could be a massive determining factor whether you're going to be picking up the A6700 or spending an extra, I suppose, about 1,000 Australian dollars on the A7 IV. So we got a lot to get through. The chapters will be in the description below. So yeah, let's get into it. So the A6700 is a 26 megapixel APS-C size BSI CMOS sensor. It can do up to 4K 60 frames per second in APS-C and 4K at 120 frames per second with a crop and 240 frames per second in 1080p. The A7 IV is a 33 megapixel full frame BSI CMOS sensor. It can do up to 4K 30 frames per second and 4K 60 frames per second with an APS-C crop, and it can do up to 120 frames per second in 1080p. And at the release time, the recommended retail price is 2,549 Australian dollars, and the recommended retail price for the A7 IV is 3,599 Australian dollars. Now, before we dive too deep into the A6700 against the A7 IV, we have to acknowledge the key difference here, and that is full frame versus APS-C. Now, full frame, essentially the key benefits of shooting full frame is to control that depth of field. You have so much more ability to control that depth of field. So a 1.4 on this versus an f1.4 on full frame will always look shallower with the full frame camera because this essentially you got to times this by a 1.5. So a 1.4 essentially is more like a 2.2 at the end of the day. Now, right off the bat, we're going to be talking about the body, and obviously it's an APS-C size camera, so it's going to have a smaller sensor, smaller body. Everything's going to be smaller on this camera, whereas the A7 IV is full frame, so it's going to be larger. So, they both are Sony E-mounts, but that means the full frame Sony lenses are generally bigger and the APS-C lenses are generally smaller. So in terms of portability, the A6700 is probably going to be better in most circumstances. Like this one is 503 grams and this one is 669 grams. So there's only 166 grams in between each, which is pretty much the weight of an iPhone is the difference. So it really comes down to what lenses you're actually going to be pairing these with. But we are blessed with Sony E-mount, which means we've got a whole bunch of different options in full frame and in APS-C. But you have to remember, if you do use APS-C lenses on your full frame camera, you should be in crop mode or at least in clear image zoom, whereas this one can utilize APS-C lenses and also full frame lenses without any sort of vignetting on those APS-C lenses. Now, when it comes to the EVF, they are slightly different. The A7 IV has that newer 3.68 million dot EVF, whereas this one has a new 2.36 million dot EVF. So it's a little bit smaller, it's a little bit less resolution, but from what I've seen, it is pretty much blackout free. So when you are a wildlife photographer, sports photographer, and you're holding down your finger when it comes to burst mode, you're not really getting any blackout, which is amazing. Now, when it comes to the back screen, they both are a 1.03 million dot screen. They are, I think, identical, but there is a little bit more versatility when you actually utilize the A6700 screen because it's got slightly newer software inside, but also that AI processing chip, which actually does help quite a lot. Now, when it comes to the screen, you can swipe across and then swipe up to get those little added menus. And it's just a little bit better than the A7 IV because the A7 IV, you can go through the menus with touch and you can also obviously object track and focus with that touch, but just not that swipe across and swipe up. Now, I think one of the biggest things happens to come down to those SD cards. So this one has a single SD card slot, whereas this one has dual SD, and one of those is Type A. And obviously Type A is a faster card. It's way more durable, but they are quite expensive. But when it comes to professionals, most prefer 2 card slots as opposed to 1 card slot. So that could be a pretty big deal for some people. And now also we're talking about slots, micro HDMI. So when it comes to video work, micro HDMI obviously isn't as reliable as a full-size HDMI, which is what you get in the A7 IV. Full-size HDMI is thicker, it's way more reliable, you can actually externally record, much better quality. This one is a micro HDMI, it can break and you don't want it to break inside your actual port itself. But hey, they got to cut back on size because this is a smaller size body. Now, a very minor thing is actually the custom buttons. This has custom 1 and custom 2, as opposed to the A7 III has a custom 3 button. So it has one extra custom button, but it's also got this little control nipple on the back, but then also an extra dial. Now, talking about those extra dials, the A6000 line didn't actually have a front dial, whereas this one now has a front dial for your aperture, which is really good. And I absolutely love that they did that because it honestly doesn't take up too much space at all to throw in an extra dial. And one of the things is that you do have that full size Z100 battery as well. So you're going to get so much better battery life out of this one than you did in the A6500 series. Now, the only one that sort of had that larger battery was the one before this, the A6600, which was almost like a baby A7 III. Okay, now we got to talk about the internals. So that's pretty much the external differences. Internals, this obviously has a 26 megapixel APS-C size sensor, and this has a 33 megapixel full frame sensor. Now, they both are technically downsampled when you go to 4K. So this is a 6K that downsamples to the 4K, and this is a 7K sensor that downsamples to that 4K. So you're going to get a much clearer and more crisp image in 4K 24 or 25 as opposed to, say, your A7S III or FX3, because it's downsampled. There's much more resolution in there, a little bit more detail, and sometimes a little bit better noise suppression because the noise is generally large, and then when you're downsampling, it actually makes the noise a lot smaller, so your signal to noise ratio is generally a lot better. And when it comes to the video recording, that's where they differ quite a lot too. This can do 4K at 120 frames per second, but obviously that 120 is a crop. And when you go 4K 60, it's just APS-C, but you can also do HD 240 frames per second in S&Q as well. Whereas this one has only 4K 60, which is cropped. And then you've got 1080p, which is full frame, but you also get that downsampled full frame. Now, when it comes to the image quality, this can be relatively subjective, but there are a couple of objective things that we need to take away. And the higher dynamic range of the A7 IV does give it a cleaner looking image. So overall, the A7 IV is a 7K sensor that downsamples to 4K, whereas the A6700 is a 6K sensor that downsamples to 4K. So you are getting a little bit better resolution and more of a sharper image in the Alpha 7 IV as opposed to the A6700 if you zoom in and put them side by side. Now you can see here in a really high dynamic range scene, the A7 IV does handle trying to bring back the image much better than the A6700. It's just really noisy in the shadows as compared to the A7 IV. But this is a very difficult situation and you probably wouldn't underexpose this much, but this just shows you the extremes of the footage and what you can get out of it if you do mess up a little bit. And I did a video testing the FX30 against the A7 IV in 1080 versus 4K 100. So there isn't much of a difference because the 1080 100 in this thing is really, really good. Plus it is 10-bit now. And that is the biggest key of this APS-C line. It is the first 10-bit APS-C in the alpha range. The FX30 brought the 10-bit in that range, whereas this one is the same sensor as the FX30 and brings that 10-bit throughout the whole range. Now, when it comes to dynamic range, the A7 IV does win in that retrospect. The A6700's got about a stop less. It's not really that noticeable, but obviously when it comes to noise reduction and slightly, I suppose, harder situations, higher dynamic range situations you're going to be in, the A7 IV will definitely do a little bit better. Now that AI processor is in the A6700, and that makes a massive difference because what that AI processor actually does is allows to have better autofocusing systems. So it is much more reliable, but you can also focus on, your insects, planes, trains, cats, dogs, whatever. You can focus on so many different more objects in this newer camera as opposed to the A7 IV. But the A7 IV is absolutely no slouch when it comes to object tracking. This thing does incredibly well, and I've had almost no issues with it at all. But also with that AI, you get auto reframing. And I talked about that in another video, and auto reframing is incredible because you can essentially sit the camera down and just walk around the frame and it will crop in and frame your face. It's pretty amazing. And you can obviously choose 3 different sizes of those auto framing: small, medium, large, and obviously the speed of which it sort of moves around. And it is a really good feature to have because if you don't know how to do that in post-production, then you're able to do it in camera. So that is really good. Now, when it comes to the newer Sony cameras, this one has the newest menu system. So they both got the really new menu system, but this has the second quick menu system. So essentially when you go right up to the top, it's got menu 1 and menu 2. You've got a little bit more quick options there, which gives you a lot more functionality when it comes to some of the features that you always need to change will be in there. And if you're used to the Sony menu systems, it should be perfectly fine to use the A7 IV, but if you're not, that quick menu is actually quite handy. Now, there also is that video self timer. So essentially, like if you want to take a photo and you have a timer set, 3, 5, or 10 seconds, you can set it down, hit record, and then sort of run back into the spot and wait those 3 to 5 seconds and it will start recording. So it's kind of cool feature. You probably won't use it very often because you could probably just cut the first 3 to 5 seconds anyway and then utilize it in your clip. But hey, 3 to 5 seconds, you're still saving on some data at the end of the day. So, I mean, it's better to have it than not have it. Now, when it comes to photography, and obviously these are hybrid cameras, and this is the interesting one because when it comes to burst frame rates, I think the A6700 is 11 frames per second, but the A7 IV is 10 frames per second in compressed RAW. Now this one doesn't have as many compression options. It's pretty much got compressed or uncompressed, whereas this one has uncompressed, it's got compressed, and then it's got like small, medium, and large compression ratios. So it gives you a little bit more options in terms of file sizes and what kind of compression you actually want. So that is a big plus with that. But the A7 IV actually is slower when it comes to frame rates. But the one thing that Sony had done with the A6700 is increase that buffer speed. So you're not waiting for the camera to, you know, clear its buffer and start shooting again. It doesn't lock itself up. It pretty much, you know, cleans that buffer straight away. So it writes to the card so much faster. So you can have a longer record time when it comes to burst frame rates. Now they both have the breathing compensation in there because obviously a lot of Sony G Master lenses and other lenses do tend to breathe, and this accounts for that as well. But they've also got the new pixel mapping, which is really cool, and I absolutely love using that when I'm trying to get critical focus when I'm in manual mode. Now, one large thing that I think that the A7 IV gets a massive win is the ability to use Super 35 crop mode. Now this is a full frame camera, and Super 35 crop mode allows you to go into that crop mode and you get essentially a lot more reach out of, say, your prime lens, or even if you've got a zoom lens, you get a 1.5 times reach on top of whatever lenses you're using. But also that means when you're cropping in on the sensor, you're actually going to get a faster readout. So the readout speed is a lot faster when it comes to putting it into crop mode, but you do have to consider as well, if you're in APS-C crop mode, it does lose resolution. So it's no longer downsampling as much from that 7K sensor, but also in photo mode, if you do end up using that crop mode, it's no longer obviously a 33 megapixel sensor. You're only using a portion, the APS-C sized of that sensor. So you do have less resolution, and that means the A6700 will be better in Super 35 or APS-C mode when it comes to photography. Now, massively, an advantage of APS-C cameras when it comes to photography is the extra reach. Now, I know a lot of wildlife and sports photographers love having APS-C cameras for the fact that you can get more reach and closer to the action. And you don't obviously have to have larger full frame lenses to be able to get that reach. But if you do have those larger full frame lenses, you can get an extra 1.5 times on top of the current lens focal length, which is amazing for sports and wildlife. Now, when it comes to the overheating tests, unfortunately, we're almost in winter, so I think Sony did that on purpose so I couldn't test the A6700, but you know, it does really well considering it is a small body. I put it in this room and it was room temperature about 24 degrees and it didn't overheat at all in 4K 25 frames per second. When it came to 4K 100 frames per second, it overheated in 20 minutes. And that is way more than enough for most people. It actually should be more than enough for everyone. when it comes to that. My shots when it comes to 4K 100 are generally 5 to 10 seconds long. That's about it. But in saying that, you know, when it comes to overheating, some people have been getting overheating with the A7 IV. I've never, ever got it to overheat. Even in my stress tests, I compared this against the ZV-E1, and this one just absolutely crushed it when it came to overheating. The A7 IV is a phenomenal camera, but also is the A6700. So in conclusion, you would have to say that the A6700 does give better value because it just does everything the A7 IV does, plus a little bit more. But you do have to consider if you need that full-size HDMI, if you need the dual card slots, and if you desire a slightly bigger body, then the A7 IV is going to be for you. Or if you do want to have, you know, larger full-frame lenses, then that's probably for you as well. But if you're not that kind of person, then the A6700 is a very, very solid option, especially for $2,500 Australian. You really can't go wrong with this camera. So anyway, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, give it a thumbs up. That would be amazing. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and a link will be in the description below if you do want to check any of these cameras out, or you want to check out my LUTs or check out my shirts as well. But yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.